People think the biggest mistake an HOA can make is sending the wrong fine. They're wrong. The biggest mistake is destroying something they never bothered to understand. The sharp metallic snip of hedge trimmers sliced through the cool morning air before I even poured my first cup of coffee. At first I thought one of my neighbors had hired landscapers early, but then I caught the smell of freshly cut roses drifting through my open kitchen window, and my stomach dropped. Those weren't just any roses. Those were mine. I ran outside, my work boots barely making it onto my feet before the front door slammed behind me. Dew still clung to the grass, sparkling under the soft Texas sunrise, but the peaceful morning was gone. 3 men wearing bright green landscaping shirts were already inside my front yard, loading flowering shrubs into the back of a trailer while another guided a commercial mower across the edge of my garden. Petals floated through the air like confetti after a celebration nobody had asked for. The low hum of the mower mixed with the steady buzz of leaf blowers, drowning out the birds that usually filled my mornings. Then I saw her. Brenda Whitmore stood on the sidewalk with a clipboard tucked against one arm, dressed in spotless white sneakers and a pastel blue blazer that somehow looked perfectly pressed before 8 in the morning. Her sunglasses reflected my front yard as if she were inspecting a construction site instead of someone's home. The corners of her mouth curled into the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She didn't look angry. She looked satisfied. Without saying good morning, she pulled a folded document from her clipboard and held it out toward me between 2 perfectly manicured fingers. $5,000, Mr. Brooks, she said in the same cheerful voice someone might use to recommend a restaurant. Community landscaping violation. Unauthorized vegetation. Immediate corrective action has already begun. The paper felt stiff in my hand, fresh from the printer, the black ink still carrying that faint chemical smell. Across the top, in bold letters, sat the number that made my pulse pound louder than the equipment tearing. Apart my garden. $5,000. I looked from the notice back to the workers. One of them hesitated for a split second before clipping another branch, almost like he knew something about this felt wrong. The freshly exposed stems glistened where healthy branches had been cut away only moments earlier. Brenda watched my expression carefully, probably waiting for shouting, arguing, or some emotional outburst she could use against me at the next HOA meeting. Instead, I slipped the notice into my back pocket and quietly reached into the other pocket for my phone. Not to call anyone, not to record, just to check a single notification that had appeared exactly 37 seconds earlier. Motion detected. Front garden. Camera 3. The tiny green icon confirmed the upload had already reached cloud storage. Every conversation, every signature, every face, every second. Brenda adjusted her sunglasses and gave one final satisfied nod before turning toward her golf cart, completely unaware that she hadn't just handed me a $5,000 fine. She had handed me the first piece of evidence that was about to bring her entire reign crashing down. I have always believed that gardens tell the truth about the people who care for them. Some people see weeds. Some people see property values. I saw memories that still refuse to fade. My name is Ethan Brooks. I am 39 years old, and for nearly 15 years I designed parks, public gardens, and outdoor spaces all across Central Texas. I spent my career helping families create places where children learned to ride bicycles, grandparents gathered for birthdays, and neighbors slowed down long enough to remember each other's names. Funny how I could design beautiful spaces for complete strangers, yet the only one that ever truly mattered sat right outside my own front porch. My wife, Emily, and I bought this little brick house 12 years earlier because she fell in love with the backyard before she ever stepped inside the kitchen. She stood beneath a crooked oak tree, smiled at me, and said, "We could make this bloom." She was right. Every Saturday became our tradition. The smell of fresh cedar mulch, the rough texture of gardening gloves covered in rich black soil, the quiet clink of metal trowels against river stones. We planted white roses after our anniversary, lavender after our trip through the Texas Hill Country, and bright yellow coneflowers because Emily insisted every garden needed something that smiled back at you. When she became sick, the garden changed with us. Hospital appointments replaced weekend vacations, but we still found an hour whenever we could to water the flowers together. Even on the hardest days, she would sit on the old wooden bench beside the butterfly bushes with a glass of iced tea while I trimmed branches nearby. She told me gardens were proof that life always found another season. Those words stayed with me after she was gone. I never had the heart to move away. Every flower bed carried a memory that no photograph could capture. Every stepping stone reminded me of muddy boots and laughter after unexpected spring rain. The neighbors understood that. Mrs. Alvarez across the street often stopped during her evening walks just to admire the hummingbirds gathering around the salvia. Little Noah from 2 houses down liked counting butterflies every Saturday morning before his baseball games. People smiled when they walked past my yard. At least they used to. Everything began changing about 8 months after Brenda Whitmore became president of the Homeowners Association. The first letter she mailed me seemed harmless enough. It suggested my native wildflowers looked unorganized compared to the neighborhood landscaping standards. Then came another notice asking me to reduce the height of my ornamental grasses. After that, she complained about butterfly habitat plants attracting too many insects. Every complaint arrived inside another perfectly sealed envelope with polished legal language that somehow managed to make flowers sound dangerous. I answered every notice politely. I sent photographs, receipts, county horticulture recommendations, and even the original landscaping approval issued years before Brenda ever joined the neighborhood. She never acknowledged any of it. Instead, every response from her became colder than the last, as though she had already decided my garden was not something worth preserving. Standing there that morning, surrounded by broken stems and freshly disturbed soil, I finally understood something that had taken months to become obvious. Brenda had never been trying to improve the neighborhood. She had been trying to erase the one place that still reminded me who I was, and she believed nobody had been watching. The strange thing about people who crave control is that they rarely start with something big. They test the edges first. A letter here, a warning there, a quiet conversation designed to make everyone else think they are simply protecting the neighborhood. Brenda Whitmore understood that better than anyone I had ever met. She had only lived in Maple Creek Estates for 4 years, yet she carried herself as though every sidewalk, mailbox, and flower bed belonged to her personally. Every Tuesday morning, she drove the neighborhood in a white golf cart instead of walking, one hand on the steering wheel and the other balancing a thick clipboard filled with violation notices. You could hear the faint electric hum of that cart before you ever saw it turning the corner. Children stopped playing when she rolled by. Neighbors suddenly remembered errands inside the house. It was remarkable how quickly an entire community learned to avoid one person. Brenda called it maintaining standards. Everyone else quietly called it surviving another inspection. During the first HOA meeting after she became president, she stood beneath the fluorescent lights of the clubhouse holding a laser pointer and spoke for nearly an hour about visual consistency, property appreciation, and neighborhood identity. Every sentence sounded polished, almost rehearsed, but there was something colder hiding underneath. She did not talk about families. She did not talk about community. She talked about compliance. I remember glancing around the room and noticing people nodding, not because they agreed, but because disagreeing seemed like more trouble than it was worth. After the meeting, she walked over to me, smiled politely, and complimented my landscaping portfolio. She said she had looked up some of my public projects online. Then she looked toward my front yard through the clubhouse window and said, almost casually, that private gardens should reflect community expectations instead of personal expression. That sentence stayed with me far longer than I expected. A week later, she mailed the first warning. Then another. Then another. The smell of fresh paper and printer ink became as familiar as the scent of mulch every time I opened my mailbox. One notice claimed my butterfly bushes obstructed visual symmetry. Another questioned whether my vegetable herbs fit the approved aesthetic. She even complained that my bird bath encouraged excessive wildlife activity. Every complaint arrived wrapped in official language, complete with section numbers and deadlines, as though nature itself needed permission before blooming. I responded exactly the way I had spent my career solving problems. Calmly, professionally. I attached photographs, county landscaping recommendations, copies of approved design plans, and emails from previous HOA boards thanking me for improving the neighborhood entrance with volunteer planting projects years before Brenda ever arrived. Days passed without responses. Instead, another envelope would appear. Another inspection. Another accusation. Then something changed. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways suddenly looked over their shoulders before speaking with me. Mrs. Alvarez quietly admitted she had received a warning after complimenting my roses during an HOA walkthrough. Mr. Collins across the street joked that Brenda probably carried a ruler in her purse, but his smile disappeared before the joke finished. Nobody wanted to become the next target. That was when I realized this had never been about flowers. The garden was simply the easiest excuse. Brenda was building something much larger than a list of violations. She was building fear, one perfectly typed letter at a time, and she believed everyone would eventually stop asking questions. She had no idea that every envelope she mailed, every inspection she ordered, and every conversation she started was quietly becoming another piece of a story she would never be able to rewrite. By the time autumn arrived, the campaign against my garden had become almost predictable. Every Thursday afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox with mechanical precision, as dependable as the mail carrier himself. The paper always carried the same faint scent of fresh toner, the same official letterhead, and the same carefully chosen language that made ordinary flowers sound like violations waiting to happen. I stopped feeling surprised. Instead, I started noticing patterns. Brenda never inspected my property alone anymore. She always arrived with another board member or an outside landscaping contractor, almost as if she wanted witnesses to validate decisions that had already been made before anyone stepped onto my lawn. The quiet crunch of polished shoes across my stone walkway became an unwelcome soundtrack to otherwise peaceful evenings. One Friday afternoon, I returned from a consulting project in Austin to find bright orange survey flags scattered throughout my flower beds. They fluttered in the breeze beside my roses, lavender, and butterfly bushes like tiny warning signs planted by someone who had never cared about the life growing beneath them. A notice taped to my front door informed me that the landscaping would be reviewed for mandatory correction if violations were not resolved within 10 business days. There was no explanation of what needed correcting beyond vague phrases like excessive natural growth and inconsistent visual presentation. I read the notice twice, then looked across the street where Mrs. Alvarez stood frozen beside her mailbox. She gave me a sympathetic smile, but quickly looked away before Brenda's golf cart rolled around the corner. That silence said more than words ever could. The following Monday, another contractor arrived carrying measuring tools and a clipboard thicker than the one Brenda usually carried herself. He walked slowly through my yard, stopping every few feet to take photographs. The clicking of his camera echoed between the houses while I stood quietly on my porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. I politely asked what standards he was measuring against. He hesitated, glanced toward Brenda waiting near the sidewalk, and simply replied that he had been instructed to document everything. His answer bothered me more than any violation notice ever had. Professionals usually explain their work. This man looked uncomfortable, like someone following instructions he did not entirely understand. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. The envelope was thicker than usual. Inside was an invoice demanding $5,000 for mandatory landscape remediation, administrative processing, contractor supervision, and continued noncompliance. According to the paperwork, the corrective work had already been authorized. My approval was apparently no longer necessary. The words felt strangely detached from reality, as though someone had skipped every step between disagreement and punishment. Then came the morning that changed everything. I woke before sunrise to the distant rumble of a trailer backing into my driveway and the rhythmic beeping of commercial equipment reversing across the curb. Through my bedroom window, I watched workers unloading hedge trimmers, wheelbarrows, and stacks of black contractor bags. The air smelled of gasoline, damp soil, and freshly sharpened steel. Brenda stepped out of her golf cart, signed a clipboard, and pointed directly toward the center of my garden without even looking at the house. She moved with absolute confidence, completely certain that nobody would challenge her authority. I stood behind the living room curtains for a few quiet seconds, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted every camera, every microphone, and every motion sensor to capture exactly what happened next. Sometimes the strongest evidence is collected by simply allowing people to believe that nobody is paying attention. I did not call the police that morning. I did not argue with the workers. I did not stand in front of the flower beds trying to stop people who believed they were simply following orders. Instead, I stepped onto the porch with a travel mug of coffee, nodded politely to the crew leader, and quietly asked if he would like a bottle of cold water before the day became too hot. He looked surprised, thanked me, and accepted it with an uneasy smile. The tension in his eyes told me everything. He was not there because he wanted to destroy someone's garden. He was there because a contract had been signed somewhere far above his pay grade. Brenda watched the exchange from her golf cart with obvious disappointment. She wanted anger. She wanted a scene. She wanted another story she could tell the board about the difficult homeowner who refused to cooperate. Instead, all she got was silence. Silence has a funny way of making confident people uncomfortable. As the workers continued trimming shrubs and removing plants they had been instructed to classify as non-compliant, I walked back inside and opened the secure cabinet beneath my desk. Inside sat several neatly labeled binders, years of project documentation left over from my landscaping career. Old habits die hard when you spend your life preparing permit packages and municipal inspections. I added one more folder to the collection. Every notice Brenda had mailed me. Every certified envelope. Every email. Every invoice. Every photograph. Every date and time. I even printed weather reports showing exactly when each inspection occurred. Documentation had always been my strongest habit. Landscapers survive by proving what existed before someone else changes it. That afternoon, I scheduled a consultation with a local attorney recommended by one of my former clients. His office overlooked the courthouse square, and the faint smell of old books and polished wood filled the waiting room. He listened patiently while I explained everything, flipping through my folders with growing interest. Then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He admitted the evidence looked unusual, but warned me that lawsuits against homeowners associations could drag on for years and become incredibly expensive. His advice surprised me. If I simply paid the fine and redesigned the yard to satisfy the board, the problem would probably disappear. I thanked him for his honesty, shook his hand, and walked back to my truck feeling strangely calm. The late afternoon sun reflected off the windshield, while dry leaves rolled across the parking lot in the warm breeze. Somewhere deep inside, I realized I had just received the answer I needed. This was never going to be solved by reacting faster than Brenda. It would only be solved by thinking farther ahead than she ever expected. That evening, another notification appeared on my phone. Motion detected. Front garden. Camera 2. I opened the recording and watched Brenda return after the contractors had left. She slowly walked through the remaining flower beds, pointing at several untouched plants while speaking to someone beside her. The audio was too distant to understand every word, but one sentence came through clearly enough to make me pause the recording. She said, "If this does not make him give up, we will find something else." I replayed those words 3 times. Then I created another backup, copied the file onto 2 encrypted drives, and uploaded it to secure cloud storage. Brenda believed she was winning because she measured success by how many notices she could send. I measured success by how much truth I could preserve before anyone realized the story was changing. I have spent enough years working with permits, inspections, and city planning offices to know one simple truth. Paperwork rarely lies. People do. The morning after I backed up Brenda's recorded conversation, I drove to the county records office just after it opened. The familiar smell of old paper, fresh coffee, and floor polish brought back memories of dozens of landscaping projects I had managed over the years. Behind the public records counter sat Linda Harper, a clerk who had processed permit applications for as long as I could remember. She recognized my name almost immediately and smiled before asking what project had brought me back this time. I simply told her I needed copies of every landscape approval, architectural review, and board amendment connected to Maple Creek Estates over the last 10 years. She raised an eyebrow but disappeared into the archive room without another question. Nearly 40 minutes later, she returned, pushing a small cart stacked with folders. I spent the next 3 hours reading every page. At first, everything looked ordinary. Meeting minutes, approval forms, maintenance budgets, routine, correspondence. Then I noticed something that made me stop turning pages. The landscaping guideline Brenda had been quoting in every violation notice did not exist anywhere before she became HOA president. I checked the revision history twice, then a third time. According to the official records, the amendment creating the new aesthetic standards had supposedly been approved 18 months earlier. But the attached meeting minutes never mentioned any vote. There was no attendance record confirming enough board members had been present. Even stranger, The approval page referenced an exhibit that was completely missing from the file. I requested the original archived copy instead of the scanned version. When Linda returned carrying a sealed storage folder, the answer became impossible to ignore. The page containing the board president's signature had been replaced. The paper stock was newer. The printer alignment was different. Even the staple holes no longer matched the surrounding documents. Someone had inserted a new approval page into an older record. My pulse stayed calm, but I could feel the weight of what I was looking at. I photographed every page using a document scanner application that automatically preserved timestamps and metadata. Before leaving, I requested certified copies bearing the county seal. Linda quietly asked if everything was all right. I smiled and thanked her for the help, telling her I simply wanted complete records for my files. Back home, I spread every document across the dining room table where Emily and I used to plan our garden layouts together. The afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating stacks of paper beside seed catalogs that had not moved in years. Then another detail surfaced. Buried inside an old email folder was a message from the previous HOA president sent almost 5 years earlier. The subject line read, "Landscape Approval Confirmation." Attached was the original site plan for my entire garden, including the butterfly habitat, ornamental grasses, native flowers, and every feature Brenda now claimed violated community standards. The message thanked me for creating a yard that reflected the neighborhood's commitment to sustainable landscaping. I leaned back in my chair and slowly connected every piece. The approved design had never changed. Only the rules had. Or at least Brenda wanted everyone to believe they had. She thought she had buried the past beneath new paperwork. She never imagined someone would compare every signature, every date, every missing page, and every forgotten email until the truth fit together like roots beneath the soil, hidden from view but impossible to remove once uncovered. Once I understood what Brenda had done, I stopped thinking like a homeowner defending a garden and started thinking like a project manager building an impossible case to ignore. The difference mattered. Homeowners argue. Project managers document. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed my normal routine so carefully that anyone watching would have assumed I had accepted defeat. Every morning, I watered the surviving flower beds before sunrise. The cool mist settled over the remaining lavender while robins hopped between the stones Emily and I had placed years before. Every afternoon, I answered another email from the HOA with the same calm, respectful tone. "Thank you for your correspondence. I acknowledge receipt. I will attend the scheduled compliance hearing." Brenda must have loved reading those replies. They sounded exactly like someone preparing to surrender. Meanwhile, my dining room slowly transformed into something very different. One wall held printed photographs arranged in chronological order. Another contained enlarged copies of HOA notices connected by colored tabs to approval documents issued years earlier. My laptop stored synchronized backups of every security recording with verified timestamps preserved in 3 separate locations. Even the motion sensor logs were organized by date, weather conditions, and camera angle. I was not building a defense anymore. I was building a timeline that could speak for itself. Then I made 3 phone calls that Brenda never saw coming. The first went to the insurance carrier listed on the HOA annual financial report. I simply asked where official documentation should be submitted if I believed the association had acted outside its governing procedures. The representative politely explained the reporting process and gave me a claim reference number without asking for conclusions. The second call went to a professional community association mediator recommended by the county courthouse. I scheduled a consultation for the week after the compliance hearing. The third call went to the landscaping contractor whose company name appeared on the invoice Brenda had sent me. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I only asked whether they could provide an itemized work order for the services performed at my property because I wanted to verify the billing. The office manager promised to email every document connected to the project. 40 minutes later, my inbox chimed. Attached to the message was the signed authorization form approving the work. I stared at the signature line for several seconds. It contained Brenda's name alone. No board approval. No secondary authorization. No meeting reference. Just one signature approving thousands of dollars in work billed in the name of the entire association. I quietly added the document to my growing collection. The hearing notice arrived the following Friday, Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the Maple Creek Clubhouse. Attendance required. Failure to appear may result in additional enforcement action. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Brenda believed she had chosen the battlefield. She imagined a room where she would present carefully selected photographs while I struggled to explain myself. She had no idea that every envelope she had mailed, every contractor she had hired, every inspection she had ordered, and every shortcut she had taken had quietly become witnesses waiting for their turn to speak. I never intended to surprise her with angry words. I intended to let her own paperwork, her own recordings, and her own decisions introduce themselves one page at a time until the silence inside that meeting room became louder than anything either of us could ever say. Tuesday evening arrived with the crisp smell of freshly mowed grass drifting across the parking lot as neighbors slowly filled the Maple Creek clubhouse. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while folding chairs scraped across the polished floor. Brenda stood confidently beside the front projector, greeting residents with the same polished smile she always wore when she believed everything was under control. A neat stack of violation packets waited on the table beside her, each one carefully organized with photographs of my garden taken from angles that made the remaining flower beds appear neglected instead of cherished. I quietly took a seat near the back of the room with a single leather binder resting on my lap. Several neighbors glanced toward me with sympathetic expressions, probably expecting another uncomfortable public lecture. Brenda opened the meeting with routine business before finally calling my name. Her voice carried easily across the room as she described repeated landscaping violations, unauthorized vegetation, and continued refusal to comply with community standards. She held up enlarged photographs of trimmed flower beds and pointed toward highlighted sections of the landscaping guidelines displayed on the projector screen. When she finished, she folded her hands together and asked whether I wished to respond before the board finalized additional penalties. I stood, thanked the board for allowing me to speak, and placed my binder on the front table. Instead of arguing, I handed each board member an identical folder containing certified county records, original landscape approvals, contractor invoices, security camera still photographs, and a simple timeline arranged by date. The room grew noticeably quieter as pages began turning. Then I connected my laptop to the projector. The first image that appeared was the original landscaping approval signed years before Brenda became president. Every flower bed currently listed as a violation had already been officially approved. The second document displayed the county's certified amendment records showing that the landscaping rule Brenda repeatedly cited had never been properly adopted through the required voting procedure. A few board members exchanged confused looks before returning to the documents in front of them. I clicked again. The screen filled with the contractor authorization form approving work inside my yard. Only one signature appeared on the page. Brenda's. No board vote. No authorization number. No meeting reference. The room became so quiet that the gentle hum of the projector suddenly sounded unusually loud. Then I opened the security recordings. The first video showed the landscaping crew entering my property while Brenda personally directed their work. The second captured her returning afterward to inspect the remaining plants. Finally, I played the audio recording that everyone in the room heard with perfect clarity. Brenda's voice calmly said, "If this does not make him give up, we will find something else." Nobody spoke for several long seconds. One board member slowly removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Brenda. Another flipped through the certified county records again before quietly asking why the approval documents did not match the official archives. Brenda attempted to explain that everything had been done in the best interest of the community, but the confidence she carried into the meeting had disappeared. Before anyone else could answer, the association attorney, who had been silently reviewing the documents, cleared his throat and recommended that all enforcement actions against my property be suspended immediately pending an independent legal review. Moments later, another board member proposed rescinding the $5,000 assessment altogether. The motion passed unanimously. As neighbors quietly filed out of the clubhouse, several stopped beside my chair, not to congratulate me, but simply to shake my hand. They had not just watched one homeowner defend a garden. They had watched the truth patiently grow until it became impossible for anyone in the room to pretend they could no longer see it. The weeks that followed felt quieter than any season I could remember. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and with every sunrise the empty spaces in my garden began filling with life again. The first thing I planted was a single white rose in the exact place where Emily and I had planted the original one years before. The morning air carried the familiar scent of damp soil mixed with fresh cedar mulch, and for the first time in months, that smell no longer reminded me of loss. It reminded me of beginning again. The HOA board hired an independent firm to review every enforcement action issued during Brenda's presidency. Several homeowners later discovered they had received notices based on procedures that had never been properly approved. Quiet conversations that had once happened behind closed doors suddenly took place in front yards again. Neighbors who used to lower their voices whenever a golf cart rolled past now stood together exchanging gardening advice over backyard fences. Mrs. Alvarez arrived one Saturday carrying homemade empanadas and a tray of tomato seedlings she insisted belonged in my vegetable bed. Mr. Collins showed up with a truck full of natural stone left over from one of his construction jobs and spent the afternoon helping me rebuild the garden border without accepting a single dollar. Even the landscaping crew that had worked under Brenda's instructions returned one afternoon on their own time. Their crew leader apologized for what had happened and volunteered several hours helping replace shrubs they had once been ordered to remove. I thanked him because I knew the difference between following instructions and making choices. One morning, as I watered the new butterfly garden, I heard the familiar sound of small footsteps crossing the sidewalk. Noah, the little boy from 2 houses down, stood at the edge of the yard holding a bright blue watering can almost as large as he was. He looked up at me with complete sincerity and asked if the butterflies would come back now that the flowers were growing again. I smiled, handed him a small packet of wildflower seeds, and told him butterflies always know where they are welcome. Together we scattered seeds across the freshly prepared soil while bees drifted lazily between the lavender blossoms already beginning to bloom. Watching those tiny seeds disappear beneath the earth reminded me that some of the most important work in life happens long before anyone else can see the results. A month later, I received an official letter from the HOA. This time, the envelope contained no threats, no deadlines, and no invoices. Inside was a formal notice rescinding every violation issued against my property, confirming reimbursement of the improper assessment, and acknowledging that my original landscaping approval remained valid. I quietly filed the letter beside every other document I had collected, then closed the binder for what I hoped would be the last time. I never celebrated because this story had never been about defeating one person. It had always been about protecting something far more valuable than flowers. People often believe justice arrives with loud speeches, dramatic victories, or angry confrontations. My experience taught me something very different. Justice grows the same way a healthy garden does. It starts beneath the surface where nobody notices. It requires patience when nothing seems to change. It depends on careful attention to every small detail. And when the season is finally right, the truth blooms so completely that nobody can honestly pretend it was never there. As the evening sun settled behind the old oak tree, a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses across the yard, and I realized Emily had been right all along. Gardens really are proof that life always finds another season, and so does justice.